Good morning, everyone. Today we will discuss about one famous biological as well as paleontological concept regarding the change or development of the present day complex life form through ages, which is known as evolution. Now, as you know, that in the early days, when many of the scientific views are mainly depicted by the our Christian popes, uh, that means all the religious peoples, they guide the scientific ideas. They told us that how God created humans and other organisms of the present day world. So this one is a famous picture. You may well aware of the picture. This is the picture of creation of Adam, and this picture is, you know, in the Sistine Chapel of Rome. So this was the earlier thoughts when people believed that there is no biological process, but humans and other organisms are created overnight by some supernatural power which they thought or which they named as God. Now, in the early 19th century, many people uh, or many scientific people, they try to disbelieve, or you may say they try to hammer this creationist idea. One of the famous or one of the pioneer workers who believed that the present day humans are the product of biological evolution through time is the famous renowned geologist William Smith, or he is also famously known as Strata Smith. Now, in the very early part of 19th century, William Smith, Britain. So from those days, people start to believe that different species also existed far before than the humans appeared in the earth scenario. And from those early life forms, from those early species, life gradually change and form some complex processes, complex um, forms. So these changes through time of different life forms is known as evolution. So we have to search for the clues in the rock record so that we can get the evidences of the biological changes that happened in the ancient time, and the evidences of those changes we have to look in the rock record so that we can better understand the processes, how the life changes through time, how they gradually developed complex forms, complex and complex morphologies, and the most important thing, who triggered these changes, or what factor is responsible for guiding these changes through time. So evolution is become one of the familiar word nowadays to us. Evolution tells us about the change of different life forms, or if you simplify this, evolution tells us about some specific changes of life through time. Now, as applied to living organisms, organic evolution involves change at several scales. The changes may be from one species to another species, changes from maybe one population to another population, changes maybe from one phylum to another phylum. So in different taxonomic level, these changes may happen, and this was happened or this development occurred through time. Now, the concept of evolution, that modern species and animals and plants, more primitive ancestors, and ultimately from the very simple life forms, these complex present day life forms are originated. This concept has been intimately bound up with paleontology. Now, the difference between the approach of a biologist and a paleontologist is entirely different. What biologists can do, they only deal with the recent day organisms. So they are able to look after the changeover of an organisms due to sudden present day factors, and this time span will be maximum 100 to 200 years, and that also requires one or two generations of biologists. But what paleontologist is able to see or is able to report, that they are dealing with the entire geological time span, the entire 4.6 billion years of earth history. So although some minute biological features that may be missing from a paleontologist's eye, or that maybe they cannot recognize in the fossil record, but the majority of the changes of life forms starting from its origin about 3.7 to 3.6 billion years ago to the present day, and how these life forms are forced to change because of the different environmental or physicochemical changes happened in the earth. So according to that, life also changes, and it is only paleontologists who can able to answer all these changes of life forms, starting from its initial simple life form to the present day more complex life forms. So by observing this temporal framework of change in life form, that is temporal framework of evolution, a evolutionary pattern of development of life form on earth can be established by a paleontologist. And this evolutionary pattern include your phylogenetic relationships, rate of evolution, trends of evolution, and the patterns of overall changes. So whenever as a science student we want to answer or we want to know about evolution, so not only we have to be a biologist, but along with we have to deal with the ancient time. That means we also take into consideration the subject paleontology, and with the help of paleontology we can only answer the origin and its development of life form and the overall changes of life form throughout the entire geological time span. So that is the main fundamental concept or contribution of a paleontologist to the concept of evolution. Now, coming to the theory of evolution. Now, whenever first word came to your mind is the name of a famous, renowned scientist, Charles Darwin. Although Charles Darwin is regarded as the father of evolutionary theory, but there were many pre-Darwinian scientists, that means those scientists who were far before than Charles Darwin. They give us some idea that animals and plants had changed over long periods of time, and these new types of species or new types of life forms had arisen from the pre-existing ones. So before Darwin, this change in life forms concept is already there. Among the pre-Darwinian scientists, the most famous one is the French scientist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck was one of the believer of changeover of life forms through time. Now, Lamarck proposed that organisms had originated from the very early primitive ancestors, and in the slow process of changes these life forms are going through, and they become adapted, they try to cope out, try to manage well with the changing environments. And for that, there are some kinds of organic grouping by which organisms or particular certain groups of organisms are more favorable, or they are more uh, able to cope out with some particular environments. So specific type of organisms, they try to adapt particular type of environments. Lamarck appreciated that in order to live, animals have to be efficiently adapted to all the physical, chemical, and biological parameters of their environment, of the habitat where they live. Lamarck believed that adaptation had come about through some kind of internal driving force. According to Lamarck, that force is known as a vital spark, and this vital spark, for animals animals feel that spark, animals try to adjust with the changing environment, they feel some internal force, internal driving force, and they try to adapt, they try to cope up with that environment. For this adaptation with the environment, the organisms, the the organisms, they required, or they uh, formed, they uh, need some kinds of acquired characters. That means those characters which they gain from their experience in surviving, in fighting with that changing nature. So they gain some characters, and with time these acquired characters were inherited. That means these acquired characters were passed through the next generation. Now, since Lamarckism is a more or less well uh, justified theory, and it says that The organism requires some kind of thrust, some kind of force to gain some experience with the changing environment so that they can acquire some characters, and these acquired characters can be passed through the next generation. But one major drawback of Lamarckism that most of the ideas of Lamarckism, most of the theories of Lamarckism, they are non-testable. And the main thing is that Lamarckism was not able to answer how the acquired character or acquired characters of by any organism, they are transferred or inherited to the next generation. So Lamarckism cannot answer the inheritance of acquired characters through generations. So there is a major drawback of Lamarckism, for which the concept of Lamarck or Lamarckism was rejected. But although Lamarckism was rejected, scientists recognize the concept of changeover of biological forms through time. That means they recognize that yes, although Lamarckism changed, but his observation relating to the evolution of biotic bodies, that they appreciated. After Lamarck, the famous scientist we all know, Charles Darwin, he, in his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, uh, was a major work, and it was published in the year 1859. Darwin provide a logical and testable theory for the evolutionary changes which scientists observe through the ancient rock records. That means what scientists observe that organisms changes through time. Apart from Lamarckism, Darwin give a more scientific view which can be testable also. What are the views of Darwin? The first one is animal species reproduce more rapidly than is needed to maintain their numbers. Animal populations, however, fluctuating, but it almost remain stable. That means what is the to maintain a stable population, to maintain the number within a animal group, animal species reproduce more rapidly because most of the newborn babies, they often suffer death or they are hunted by other organisms during their grow up. So that is why animal species try to reproduce more and more, so that although most of them face death during their journey of life, but among all them, if some are survived, then they can cope up with this environment, and thereby the balance, the total numbers within the population can be maintained. Second, there must be a competition within and between species. So this is very important. There must be competition within and between species in the struggle for existence. And the competition is mainly done for three purposes. The first is food, second is for living space or living area, and third is for mate, that is for sexual reproduction purpose. So for these three need of an organism, the organism often fight or organism often compete with each other, that means within species and even between species also. Within species, all animals vary, and this variation is inherited. According to Darwin's concept of this variation of organisms, variations of individual within a single species, this is known as intraspecific variation. The fourth one is the in the struggle for life, those individuals which are best fitted to survive in a particular environment, those are the ones who survive, who are able to live, and thereby they reproduce. According to Darwin, this is known as survival of the fittest. So those organisms, those individuals which are fittest for survival, only they will live and reproduce. The others, weaker ones of the population, they will simply wipe out from the history. That means they will simply die. According to Darwin, this is called natural selection. So in this natural selection, that means those individuals which are selected naturally, which are most fitted for survival, those successful individuals will therefore successfully reproduce young juvenile ones which resemble themselves, and this is the process of inheritance of acquired characters. So what Lamarck cannot explain, that how inheritance bring forward to the next generation, Darwin gave some idea about this carry forward of acquired characters. That means acquired about this inheritance property of characters of an organisms. So only, it is not all organisms can do, but only those are fitted well enough to that environment. That means those are naturally selected. They are only able for inheritance. So this is known as Darwin's natural selection. Now, Darwin considered that the origin of new species came about through some gradual accumulation of different favorable characters within the within successive populations, leading eventually to the separation of new species. So Darwin gave an idea how new species will appear from the existing ones. So in the struggle for existence, species gradually acquired some characters, and these characters are not acquired equally within the entire population. So within the population, certain individuals, they are able to acquire these characters, and which ultimately lead them to separate out from the original larger population, and thereby by separation from the original larger group, this small population group which are able to acquire some characters for a particular environment, they are they became well adapted to their environment, and thereby they formed new developed characters for survival. And by this way, one existing species, a part of the population is separated out, and thereby they formed new species at different population with different morphological characters. However, Darwin was unable to clarify how inheritance worked. Darwin explained that inheritance of characters, how people separated out, and some kind of isolation occurs, and through this isolation, through biological reproduction process, the acquired characters inherited. But how actually, what are the biological process within reproduction that this inheritance occur? That means those favorable characters which were accumulated by the ancestors, they were passed in the next generation, and new improved developed character arise that Darwin was not able to answer. So it was far before than the discovery of chromosome or discovery of DNA, RNA, discovery of genes. So it was the discovery of chromosome and genes within the eukaryotic cells. Then people can answer the inheritance of favorable characters through genes to the next generation. So although Darwin, in Darwin's time, Darwin was not able to answer this inheritance how worked. So some scientists, after the discovery of chromosome genes, they modify the Darwin's concept or Darwin's theory a little bit on the basis of the new inventions of biology, and they represent the Darwin theory into a new look. But the basic thing, that is the survival of the fittest, natural selection, and those naturally selected organisms, they inherited the acquired characters. These things remain same in the modern improved Darwin's theory. So nowadays, people told this improved version of Darwin theory as neo-Darwinian synthesis. So people recognized Darwin's work. People did not rejected Darwin's theory. People did not simply erased Darwin's name from the evolutionary concept, but they represent the Darwin's theory in the newly um, evolved, in a newly invented biological point of view, and that is why they named this as neo-Darwinian synthesis. Now, what is the contribution of paleontology to evolution? Now, the unique contribution of paleontology, therefore, the fossil record, although imperfect, we know that fossil record is incomplete. Many of the record of ancient organisms, they are not preserved. Although it is not perfect, but fossil record is the only real evidence, is the only tool to us which can depict the changeover of organisms through the entire geological time span. Now, fossil record actually explain us, or actually shows us the idea of evolution in two scales. So all the changes in the inheritable, in the heritable traits, in the heritable properties, they are passed within a population across generation. That is the concept of evolution, and this is evidences in the fossil record also. Now here you can see an picture by which you can easily understand the contribution of paleontology to this evolutionary concept or evolutionary science. It supposes that present day organisms have all been derived from the organisms that lived in the past. As I already told you, that scientists believe that life become developed or life become more complex from the earlier simple life forms, simple prokaryotic aquatic life forms. They undergo several changes, and through those successive changes, newer and more complex life form appears, and through those all those changes, nowadays we belong to the earth. So new species have been produced, and many of those species gone extinct completely. That means they completely erased out, completely wipe out from the earth history. So we can draw a tree of life like our family tree, like our forefathers to our grandfather to our parents to us, and it will continue. So like our family tree, we can also draw a tree of life to show how every species is related. Here you can see a evolutionary tree starting from the early prokaryotic life forms, then unicellular life forms with eukaryotic cells, properly nucleated cells to that will branch to various divisions, and present day all complex life forms, all complex animals and plants appeared from these earlier ones. So from this tree, you can see that although it have a main stem, it have a main source from which all the branches emerge. That means although the earlier life forms was same, and they are the simple life forms, prokaryotic, unicellular life forms, which can only survive in the hot aquatic condition. Uh, from that, gradually it develops, gradually it goes through some changes, and different branches emerge. So this was the main concept of evolution, how life grows from the earlier simple ones to the present day complex one. Now in the right hand picture, this picture was drawn in the Natural History Museum of London by the famous artwork of artist Tanya Kovics in recognition of the contribution of Charles Darwin when the book of Darwin completed 150 years. That is, the origin of species completed its journey 150 years. That is, it is drawn in 2009 in recognition of the Darwin's contribution in the evolutionary idea. So, in recognition of the Darwin's contribution in the Natural History Museum, London, this artist Tanya Kovics, she draw this oak tree in the roof of the museum, which depicts the change of life forms through time. Now, what are the evidences by which you can say about the organic world's evolution happened in the ancient past? Now, one famous example we all know that there are some dinosaurs in the Mesozoic time, and the major amount of birds are observed in the Cenozoic time. And people believe that these birds came from the dinosaurs. Now, before the discovery of Archaeopteryx, this was simply a belief. this was simply just a storytelling that birds came from dinosaurs. But many people did not believe this theory because dinosaurs are so huge, so large, whereas birds are much, much smaller compared to dinosaurs. Even almost all dinosaurs, they are not able to fly. Most of the dinosaurs. There are few who can fly, but most of the dinosaurs, they are not able to fly. Whereas whenever we heard the term bird, the first thing came into our mind is a organism who can fly. But there are very few birds who cannot fly actually, or they fly for a little time. So although there are many differences between these organisms, between these two groups of organisms, people believe that birds derived, but evolutionarily formed through some changes of dinosaurs. So mostly this was a storytelling thing until the discovery of Archaeopteryx. When people found the fossil record of Archaeopteryx, they found that these organisms bear some characters of reptile, bear some characters like dinosaur, as well as it bears some characters of birds also. So some famous reptilian character is tooth, beak, winged claws. That means the wings, fingers. They have claws like a reptile. Whereas it also have some characters of bird. One famous character is the appearance of feather, which acts as a airfoil to better fly, better float in the atmosphere. So when people discover the fossil of Archaeopteryx and they found that this is a organism which is basically intermediate between the reptile dinosaur and the flying birds. So then people firmly believed with firm evidences that yes, changeover from dinosaur happened and this changeover is real, and dinosaur, that means reptiles, gradually changed to its new life form, new life mode, that is the avian life mode, in which they can fly, and the newly developed, newly evolved organism is known as bird. So Archaeopteryx is the missing link between the evolutionary history from reptile to bird. So you can now see that how paleontology helps us to understand all the changes of life forms through time. And this can only be said with the help of these kinds of discovery in which the missing link, the missing part of the biological changeover through time can be identified in the rock record. Now, the fossil record actually reveals two scales of evolution. One is microevolution, another is known as macroevolution. So you can get an idea from the name. Micro means finer, lower in size. Macro means higher in size. Now, what do you mean by size in this evolution concept? Here, size means the taxonomic level. That microevolution happens in lower taxonomic level. Mostly it is restricted within species level or genus level, whereas macroevolution is considered in higher taxonomic level, that is in say for example class, order or phylum level. So in different taxonomic level, the evolutionary changes can happen, and according to that, different names are proposed. In lower taxonomic level, the evolutionary changes are known as microevolution. In higher taxonomic level, the evolutionary changes are known as macroevolution. Now, microevolution can be of two types. There are two models of microevolution. That means species level changes. The first one is known as punctuated model or punctuated equilibrium, whereas the second one is known as phyletic gradualism or simply gradualism. Now, the theory of punctuated equilibrium was proposed in the year 1972 by two renowned paleontologists, Eldridge and Gould. In punctuated model, Eldridge and Gould said that the changeover from one species or one life form to another is sudden. Here you can see a tree of life where a species range is shown by these vertical lines. Basically, it's a simple binary plot. In the x-axis, you can see the morphological changes or morphology of the species. So every point within this binary plot in the x-axis, they demarcate certain specific morphology. And in the y-axis, that is time. So we are basically trying to observe change of morphology through time of any species, of any certain group of organisms. So here, by this plotting by this vertical line, or in this picture also by this vertical line, that indicates that the species range is from this point to this point. That is the vertical time range of this species. After that, the species got extinct, and the morphology of this species lies here, and the morphology remains constant throughout this entire journey of the species. This constant morphology of the species, this constantness of the morphology of species is known as stasis. Now, in punctuated model, scientists proposed that new morphologies appeared in the fossil record suddenly, and after the appearance of these new morphologies, that means new life forms. So whenever from this point a new morphology appeared from this species, that shifts from this point. So new morphology now appeared here. The morphology point in the x-axis become this. So that indicates these two are separate in morphology. So whenever new morphology appeared from the existing life forms, they becomes new species, and it happens within a very short amount of time, almost instantaneous, almost within blink of an eye. So thereby, in time axis, in the y-axis, it is almost fall in a single point. There is no separate time difference between the last appearance of this ancestor species and the first appearance of newly evolved species. So it's a sudden phenomenon, and after this sudden appearance of new morphological characters by which a new species appeared, in the rest of the time of that species, in the remaining time of the species, that character remain unchanged throughout its journey. This unchanged variety, unchanged character of the proper of that morphological character is known as stasis. So here you can also see one species started its journey from here, then all of a sudden a separation in morphology happened and a new species appeared. Similarly, at this point also, all of a sudden separation in morphology appeared and a new species appeared. After the appearance of new species, the morphology becomes almost constant. So there is no change in morphology in this species. That means it's showing stasis, it's showing constant morphology. This constant morphology of a species is known as stasis. That means there is no change. Again, within that species, all of a sudden another new species appeared with different morphology, and again after its appearance it goes through some stasis. So like this way, all the species, according to this model, all the species appeared from its ancestor all of a sudden, almost within a blink of eye in terms of geological time scale, and after the appearance they are completely distinguished from its ancestor. That means morphologically they are different from its ancestor, and after the appearance of new morphological characters or new species, they remains unchanged through the rest of the journey of their life forms. That means through the rest of the journey of that species, which is known as stasis. So that is the main concept of punctuated model or punctuated equilibrium model proposed by Eldridge and Gould. Now, for that punctuation type of evolutionary change, microevolutionary change to be happened, allopatric speciation is required. Now, what is allopatry? I come later. The second type of microevolutionary process was known as phyletic gradualism. So it is the more Darwinian approach of microevolution. What it says, as Darwin proposed that in the struggle for existence of life, organisms gradually acquired characters. So basically, this model was proposed uh, from the Darwin's concept, and after this model in 1972, so that's a more recent phenomena. Darwin's concept was 1859. So punctuated model is most recent proposal of microevolutionary changes. Anyway, so according to Darwin concept, organisms acquired some characters through gradual changes. That means the morphology of an organism never stops at any point. They always change gradually through time. That means changing continuously and gradually, starting from the origin of one species to up to its extinction. So if you consider the range of one species and the morphological change, you can see that a species appeared here at this point. Say for example, this one is the morphology, and with time the species journey happens in this pattern. So after at T1 time, say for example at T1 time when the species started its journey, its morphology is here, and at T2 time when the species ends its journey, its morphology is here. So you can see that a species as a whole, their morphological changeover is happened through its entire journey. And according to Darwin, this changeover of organisms happened due to adaptation of the organisms of the population to the changing environment, and this change happened gradually. So that is why this process of microevolutionary change is known as gradualism or simply phyletic gradualism. Now, a famous example of this process is the Archaeopteryx. That is a gradual change of reptilian form through the intermediate form Archaeopteryx, which bears both the characters of reptile and avis, reptile and bird, and ultimately they changed to a new form, avis. So this change is a gradualistic way by which the reptilian character gradually transformed through some intermediate stages to a new life form. That means if you name the say for example, when the species started its journey, here the species named is A, and when it ends its journey, here the species named suppose as B, because a, or say for example here it is a dashed. Why I saying a dashed? Because from starting its journey from A to a dashed, a huge morphological change is happened. Or even you can call this species as B also, because there are lots of morphological changes happened. This morphology, the morphology of this species at point A and morphology of this species at point B is not same. They are completely different. But we can see that it is coming from point A. Now, when a species started its journey from point A and ends at point B, we may get several intermediate points. Say, for example, here we get the intermediate point A1, which bears some characters of A and some characters of B. We also can get some intermediate points A2, which also bears some character of A and some character of B also. So, from its journey from A to B, if phyletic gradualism is happened, we always get these intermediate fossils, these intermediate life forms, that is A1, A2. So if A is your dinosaur and B is your bird, then A1, A2 is your Archaeopteryx. In contrast to this gradualistic model, what is the difference in punctuation? In punctuation, what we get, there was stasis in morphology of species, and the speciation happened all of a sudden. So you can see that here if it is A and if this species is B, so there is no intermediate variety between these two species, between these two life forms, because this change from A to B is almost instantaneous. You can see that in y-axis, this changeover almost cuts in a point, whereas here you can see that in the y-axis, this covered this much of time span. So that is why it's a slow, gradual process, and you can get all the intermediate forms. But in punctuated model, it's a instantaneous process. It's happened all of a sudden, and thereby you are only able to see, or you only find the end products. No intermediate products are found. That is the main difference between these two models. And this gradualistic process of uh, my gradualistic model happened in sympatry. Now, it should be clear to you that some kind of isolation is required, because what I previously told you, that whenever a new species have to appear in microevolutionary process, they have to undergo some kinds of changeover, some kinds of new physico-chemical condition in which they have to adapt. So whenever there was speciation, that means they are exposed to a new physico-chemical biological conditions in which they are able to cope up, they can survive, they can adapt, and therefore naturally selected and uh, creates new morphological characters which can be inherited. So this process may be gradual, this process may be instantaneous, sudden. But whatever is the process, whether it is phyletic gradualism or it is punctuated equilibria, for appearance of new species from an existing one, it is required some amount of or some kind of isolation in nature. Now, isolation can happen. Isolation, that means among the entire population, a small part becomes separated out, becomes isolated by some way. Say, for example, there are 20 individuals within a population, within a species, and among these 20 individuals, 5 are separated out, 5 becomes isolated. Now, how this isolation can happen? One easier way of isolation is geographical isolation. So some part of the population, they are cut off from the rest of the population by a barrier, and this barrier may be a geographical barrier. That means maybe there was a large mountain range, maybe there was a large lake, maybe there was land area compared to the aquatic organisms, maybe the depth of the aquatic body increased by some way, and thereby the uh, ancestor population becomes fragmented. So any kind of geographical barrier may appear there, which may be responsible for isolation of the ancestral population, and they divided into two or more than two groups. Now, whenever they are isolated, that means those smaller population, the ancestral population still remains in its original habitat. That means they are still in its original physico-chemical condition. So they are not feeling any threat, they are not feeling any change in environmental condition. But the isolated population, the isolated individuals, they are now exposed in a new kind of physico-chemical biological condition. And that isolation, as I told you, that is happened due to some geographical barrier. So those isolated individuals, they have to adapt, they have to cope up with the changing environment. And this process of, or this way of isolation and adapting to that changing environment, and ultimately establish them into that changing environment, and forms a new modified or newly evolved species with some modified morphological changes. This process of speciation is known as allopatric speciation. So that means those isolated individuals, they are in allopatry. That means they lost their connectivity with the ancestral stock, with the main stock. So they are isolated. That means they are allopatric in condition. They are allopatrically separated. In contrast, in case of gradualism, when speciation occurs in sympatry. Now, when sympatric occur, again, for speciation to occur, isolation is required. But here in sympatry, the isolation is not physical. The isolation is not any kind of geological barrier, or sorry, any kind of geographical barrier. But in case of sympatry, the isolation of the individuals happened due to some kinds of biological or ecological barrier. How biological barrier can happen? Suppose you are living in a place, and among you, some individuals are going to the hilltop and they are started living in that place. So when those individuals are going to hilltop and started living in that place, now they lost their connectivity, biological connectivity, although physical connectivity is there from the position of the ancestral stock to the hilltop, although physical connection is there, but due to avoid the workout to bring back to their ancestral population and again go to hilltop or any kind of these things, if somehow the biological connectivity between that isolated individuals and the parental stock is lost, so sometimes organisms became more restricted to an area, and by that the gene flow of organisms through successive generations becomes very much restricted. And we all know that the acquired characters were passed through this chromosomal transfer. Now, whenever the gene flow is restricted within very few individuals, the organisms becomes very much rigid to certain characters, to the uh, chromosomal transfer, and thereby to some specific conditions, to some specific physicochemical conditions. So, a separation in biological chromosomal transfer happened between the two population, and although there are no geographical barrier, but due to biological barrier there may be speciation in those isolated groups over the hilltops. So this kind of speciation is known as sympatric speciation or anagenesis. So keep in mind, for allopathic speciation, there must be geographical barrier by which the uh, some individuals of the population have to be isolated. For sympatric speciation, although there did not have any um, geographical barrier, but there should be some biological restrictions, some biological barrier by which some individuals of the population are separated out and they formed some new species which is known as sympatric speciation or anagenesis. Now, apart from the microevolutionary process, macroevolutionary process are also two types. One is adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation, in this process, organisms increase in their diversity all of a sudden, and this increase in diversity happened very rapidly, and they formed multiple newly developed forms, and this was happened because they adapt to the new ecological environments, to the newly open, to the newly available environmental conditions. Now, most evolutionary change seems to occur a proliferation of higher taxonomic groups that may happen in genus level, in species level also. But adaptive radiation commonly found to occur immediately following an evolutionary breakthrough, that means an evolutionary innovation, and this leads to origin of newer and newer varieties of life. Say for example, Here you can see that although mammals are present from Mesozoic time, but in the Cenozoic time, after the death of dinosaurs at the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, when all the dinosaurs are completely extinct, then mammals flourished. Lots of varieties, lots of new types of mammals arise because when dinosaurs becomes completely extinct, so the entire ecological niche is now almost vacant, and capture mammals try to inhabit in those vacant ecological conditions, and thereby they try to adapt to all the possible places where they can approach. So for that, different groups of mammals appeared in these newly opened ecological environmental conditions. So that basically happened due to the extinction of dinosaurs. So that is the evolutionary uh, innovation which happened in mammals group due to the extinction of dinosaurs. Similarly, you also heard the name about Cambrian explosion, when all the Precambrian groups, they suffer some kind of extinction at the Precambrian Cambrian boundary at 540 million years, and the environment is also changing. So at 540 million years time, newer and newer environmental condition is now available, and oxygen becomes more oxygenated, atmosphere becomes more oxygenated. So organisms approach new environmental conditions, and thereby they produce newer and newer life forms. Similarly, at KT boundary, the birds will flourish. You can see that at Jurassic and Cretaceous time, different kinds of dinosaur flourishment will occur. So all these flourishment of organic groups, mostly these are of in higher taxonomic level, they occur due to the opening of new environmental niches, and all of a sudden within a very short period of time they are flourishing and occupying these newly opened habitats. This is known as adaptive radiation. Radiation means flourishment. Huge numbers came, and this happens due to adaptation to newly opened environmental niches. The second process of macroevolution is known as mass extinction. Now, in mass extinction, although new life forms did not arise, what we previously learned in all the microevolutionary and macroevolutionary processes, that new life forms appeared, whether it is punctuated equilibria or phyletic gradualism or adaptive radiation. That new life forms come, but in extinction, which is another macroevolutionary process, here, in contrast to the appearance of new life forms, in this type, a large number of organisms are are facing death within a very short interval of time. So, the evidence of mass extinction in rock record can be identified when the standing diversity of higher taxa falls dramatically. Here you can see this picture was famous to all of us. That is the biodiversity curve through time. Number of genera was plotted against time in the x-axis, and you can see how number of genera changed through time. So this is the biodiversity curve of generic level through time. Now you can see that there are certain levels. At Cambrian time, biodiversity increases. At Ordovician time, biodiversity increases. But there are certain levels, there are certain points when there is abrupt fall, vertical fall of this biodiversity. Look at these points. The end Ordovician, end Devonian, end Permian, end Triassic, and end Cretaceous. So these are the five major ones in which the fall of diversity is highly noted. Apart from that, there are others also. Here you can see an in Silurian, this is a small one. There was an in Jurassic one. So there are also numerous smaller ones, but these are the five major fall of diversity happened again within a blink of an eye, within very short time interval. So these big fives among all the others extinction happened throughout the entire geological time. These fives are the major ones. So that is why they are also known as big five extinctions. And the term mass is applied when there was lots of biological forms of different groups, both from aquatic, terrestrial, and within the aquatic and terrestrial, there are different groups. All this suffer death due to some reason. Then it is known as mass extinction. So, in the entire geological time span, it is observed that at five times the biodiversity dropped in a huge rate, and it is almost within a very short time span, almost within few million years. And in geological time scale, few million years is almost like a blink of an eye. So that is why it is called as big five mass extinction boundaries. This is very important. These five: end Ordovician, end Devonian, end Permian, end Triassic, and end Cretaceous. Okay. Now, why we call them as big five? Why these five are only famous? Because extinction is happened throughout the entire span of life. From your early classes, you may claim that in almost every day, one or several species are suffered extinction. That means their journey through this uh, time ends. Journey of a species ends. So extinction is a day-to-day event. It is going on in every day, in every year, in every million year. So that extinction is known as background extinction. Now, apart from this day-to-day extinction process, regular extinction process, that is the background extinction process, there are certain geological interval times in which the rate of extinction becomes excessively high. As this rate of extinction becomes excessively high compared to the background level, that is why they are called as mass extinction. And among different mass extinctions, these five are the major mass extinction. That is why they are known as big five. Now the question comes, is there only extinction occurred that is during this time interval, say for example late Cretaceous? So in late Cretaceous, only species are going to extinct. There was no appearance. No. The thing is, whenever there was mass extinction or whenever there was extinction, at the same time there was appearance of new species also going to be happen, or appearance of new species are also happened there. So both extinction and appearance are going on side by side. When one increase, one name is proposed. When the other one is suppressed, when suppose the appearance of new life forms increased, extinction was suppressed, extinction was too low, then we call them as adaptive radiation in terms of macroevolutionary processes. When appearance rate is low but extinction rate is much higher than the appearance, then we call them as mass extinction process or mass extinction in terms of macroevolutionary processes. So both mass extinction, or you may call extinction, and appearance control the whole pattern of the evolution of life by resetting it time to time, and newer and different forms of life appear with newer and different physicochemical conditions, physicochemical as well as biological conditions of the earth. So, being a paleontologist, we have to always search the clues. Now, one very important quote of a renowned scientist is that there is no fixed model for evolution of any group. That is, you cannot say that the dinosaur group is uh, evidencing phyletic gradualism, or you cannot say that the dinosaur group is evidencing punctuated equilibria. All these things, they can be happened in species wise. So one species of dinosaur may show phyletic gradualism, another species of dinosaur may show punctuated mode, that is punctuated equilibrium of microevolution. Even within the same time, same threats or same environmental parameters, changeover of environmental parameters, that means physical, chemical, or biological change, may help to guide phyletic gradualism for one group of organism, and the same physicochemical biological changes may guide to punctuated equilibrium type of evolution for another group of organisms. So the cause may be same, but the uh, how an organism behave to that cause and how they try to adapt to these causal factors, that path may be different. One group may follow phyletic gradualism, one group may take punctuated equilibrium path. So that's all. That's a brief idea about evolution and different evolutionary processes. Thank you.